Hello everyone, I'm Instructor Hollon, and this lecture introduces us to ethics and the subject of our study for the course. So we ask, what is ethics? Ethics is a branch of philosophy, and Levin defines ethics in the following way. Ethics is the study of right, wrong, bad, and good. It's very simple and not very informative. The words can almost seem circular, and we'll see this is just a standard problem in ethics. We have to give definitions of what we mean by right, wrong, good, and bad in terms of other things, observations and such. And so it can be difficult to define in a non-circular kind of way. It seems that any definition we give presupposes some understanding of ethics. So the definitions are somewhat circular in the field, but it's recognized in other fields as well that problems like this can arise, and we still know what we're talking about, so we do the best we can. Okay, for more information on the definition, see Levin, the zero-cost textbook for Introduction to Ethics, an open educational resource published in 2019 on page 1, very first page. And all the zero-cost material assigned in the course and the readings will be are provided free as PDF downloads in the course modules. You can find these in the Week 1 course modules, and you'll find them linked elsewhere as well in discussion and lectures and so forth. So this branch, ethics, can be further subdivided then into two fields. The first one is called normative ethics, and the second one is called meta-ethics. Again, Levin provides the following definitions. The application of moral theories to actions is sometimes called applied or normative ethics. Page 2. Normative ethics helps us decide what is good or bad, right or wrong, and is applied ethics in particular contexts, cases, or examples. Okay, so when you're asking a question at the supermarket, if you see someone steal a loaf of bread and you might ask, should I report this person? What do I do? That would be an instance of applied ethics in a case where you're thinking about a moral judgment. Okay, so for meta-ethics, though, meta-ethics is a branch of philosophy that deals with the theory of morality, from the Greek word meta, meaning about. So about ethics, and you could find the definition again in Levin 2019, page 2. So meta-ethics is more theoretical and asks questions about the nature of ethics, and this includes the meaning of ethical terms and language. So it's more abstract, and you're thinking about ethics in general and not asking, what do I do in this particular case, if that makes sense. So let's look at ethics and other types of evaluation for a contrast. There is a distinction between evaluative and descriptive judgments and claims. A description merely describes something that is. So it doesn't carry with it an evaluation or an imperative, a should. For example, a description of a knife is not the same as judging whether it is a good one with which to prepare dinner. Okay, depending on the type of dinner that you might want to prepare, the knife may be good for that purpose or not, right? So just the description alone isn't enough. You need more to make those kinds of evaluative claims, okay? So evaluative judgments move beyond descriptions or descriptive claims to offer a should or ought claim that informs our behaviors. Moral judgments are evaluative, but not all evaluative claims are moral claims. For example, telling someone they should wear a raincoat if they do not want to get wet in the rain is different from saying that we should support capital punishment. Okay, how do we distinguish between these different types of evaluative claims? One suggestion is that the moral claims carry accountability in contrast to other evaluative claims. So one way to tell them apart is to focus on which one takes precedence over others in terms of accountability. This question deserves further reflection, but the preceding explanation provides sufficient grounds from which to move on with our study. So consider sociobiology and the naturalistic fallacy. Okay, we'll look more at these subjects as well in the course. There is a difference between what is natural and what is good. They're not synonymous. They don't mean the same things. So the common fallacious assumption is that a common assumption that is false is that if something is natural, then it must be good. Or if something is not natural, it must be bad. And this is simply not the case. For example, our bodies may produce natural toxins that are dangerous for us at different stages of human development. But this does not mean that we should not counter these toxins with modern medicine or chemistry. The famous philosopher David Hume pointed out the fallacy in this case, and it has become widely known as Hume's law. One cannot derive an ought from an is. For more explanation, see discussion of more in this regard, another famous philosopher commenting on Hume. See the Dimmock and Fisher zero-cost textbook, published 2017, page 6 and 102 to 104. Okay, there are those who disagree with Hume somewhat. Hume's reasoning was very general, and he thought that you could never have natural ground for moral judgments. People disagree with that, though. Some people think that all moral judgments have to have natural grounding, or that at least some of them do, or that some natural grounding provides grounds for moral judgments, even if they're really precise. So there's disagreement about Hume's argument amongst ethicists today. And those who disagree with him think that morality is closely connected with nature. Okay, now that general idea is common to several moral theories at which we will look in the course. For example, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, natural law theory, rights ethics, and care ethics. 5 different theories that will disagree with Hume's really sweeping argument here. Keep that in mind. Will other theories disagree with, build on his argument and might disagree with the way it's presented, but then refine it or something like that. So we'll look at the different options, the way people respond to Hume. But for our introduction lecture, just keep in mind that he's got a really good idea here. We can't just say what is natural obviously makes what is good or bad, but he does present it in a very sweeping manner to just do away with any possible connection between the natural world and morality, and that looks too fast, too big of a jump. We'll question that in the course, okay? So the goal of ethics on the approach of, say, sociobiology, or those that try to look for natural explanations of ethics, is to act in ways that help the majority to live happily. This is utilitarianism. Or to develop our character. That's virtue ethics, and so on. So they look at specific things about us and nature and try to make a correlation between those things and morality. So that's where they'll disagree with Hume, and we'll be precise about it, but the theories are precise. When we look at them, we'll learn more about them. So a recent naturalistic version of morality is called sociobiology, and is in the field of sociobiology. It kind of weds sociobiology with ethics and philosophy, okay? So, and it seeks to explain moral judgments and behaviors based on their hypothetical role played in the course of evolution. So the idea is that altruistic acts of, say, selflessness, sacrifice, and such, caring for others, are explained as being more beneficial to the herd or to the group, and so are more useful for survival, not just of the individual, but of the group itself. And so they were naturally then selected for through the course of human evolution because they helped us survive better. All right. So that makes a lot of sense. One worry with that spin on this idea of a natural grounding for morality is that we'll look at it throughout the course, but we wonder if that does or does not commit this naturalistic fallacy to explained by Moore, commenting again on Hume's concern, the Azot problem. So what's going on there is that we think if we look at cases like, say, incest in the wild, with animals in the wild and practicing incest, we can see and make observations that we don't think tell us about how we should behave. And so then we might think the practice, though, of incest may be more beneficial to survival of the species in some cases. Say there are few selective options for mates in a community. Sometimes some cultures have to do this. Now, in Tibet, living conditions in part of Tibet are harsh, and brothers are forced to share a wife in some cases out of just necessity for survival, because there's not many options, there's not many people there. So something like that might show then that what if this couple happens to be this relationship happens to be an incestual one, but is necessitated by survival and circumstances in the environment? Okay, well, that would be a very specific case, not a general case, but in that environment, that would be the practice, right? So in that case, we could see how incest might be beneficial. Strange to say, but in some cases, we can imagine that. So while we do also inbreed animals, the moral question still arises for us, though. Is incest right or good? And we see then we kind of need to look at the cases, right? It can't just be a general. Hume's idea is, see, we can't draw any observation from nature, but when we look at the case like the one from Tibet that I mentioned, we see that that general idea doesn't apply always. Even if it generally does, there will be counterexamples, but that just shouldn't be if Hume's argument is right. Okay, but still, we might wonder about the efficiency of sociobiology to ground moral judgment. Say we do get descriptions of things. Does that alone tell us from nature? Does that alone tell us whether something is moral or not? There, the problem is that we do need to look at the cases. So even for a sociobiological or natural explanation of moral behavior, we kind of run into the same problem Hume had then. We still need to look at context in different cases. So it's hard to say sociobiology makes for one rule across the board, if that makes sense. That's the worry with a sociobiological approach to morality. We'll look more at the prospect, though, and the theory later in the course. So I mentioned this now as a worry with theory, but it's still a potential. It's a candidate for moral theory and presents some response to Hume. And we'll look at Hume and his argument again, the Azot problem, and the related naturalistic fallacy, because it's a prominent, it's a common problem addressed in ethics. Okay, so we'll look at it in more detail throughout the course. Now let's look at ethical terms. The terms right and wrong are used to say something about a behavior. We see a piece of behavior, action, right? The way someone should act in a certain case follows from the right or wrong judgment. The statements, this is right or wrong, offers a prescription of the way someone should behave, in other words, and are often black and white. It's often the case we can tell whether something's right or wrong easily. In contrast, though, that's not always the case, but it is a common case, right? We could tell easily that we just shouldn't rob people for no reason and similar things, right? So some cases are pretty straightforward, other cases will be more difficult. But in contrast, the terms good and bad are used to say something about a state of affairs that is more descriptive, without saying someone should do it or not, right? So there are also degrees of goodness. something can be more beneficial to a group of people than not, or than other alternatives, right? But there are no degrees of right and wrong. Something is either right or wrong. So there can be a separation between right and wrong, good and bad. And that's an important distinction for the terms, and we'll see how that distinction arises when we handle ethical theories. Keep it in mind in your discussions and in your research that these four terms can be defined differently, often are, and that will make for more complexity when you read the theories, when you read about the theories and the cases that at which we'll look, different cases, okay? Um, so let's turn next to ethics and reasoning. And this will be important for how you approach the activities and especially applying the material to your lives, daily lives. Um, so it's an important leg in the introduction to learn about which to learn in the study of ethics. So we need to offer, the way reasoning works is we offer justification for a claim, right? Someone says, this is the case, and you might think, okay, well, why is that the case? And so you offer a reason for it. And that's just how reasoning works, okay? Justification is needed. Otherwise, it's kind of like opinions if you don't need justification. Anyone can say anything, and then anything flies. But that's not true in ethics and in other fields, right? We can't just make things up. So we need to pay attention to the rules of reasoning, kind of the rules of the road, so to speak, right? So in our discussions and in handling subjects, cases, and theories, when we make judgments, we want to try to have justification for those judgments. Think of them as kind of like logical moves in a game of chess or something like that. When you make a judgment, it's making a move, and you want to have a reason for that move, okay? Whether it's a good one, rational or non-rational, there's a distinction there for our moral judgments, okay? These justifications often take the form of explanations and arguments. And so to this end, be sure to use the Svalba's article, What is Ethics and What Makes Something a Problem for Morality? And this article is in the Levin Zero Cost book, 2019, page 7 to 16. It's a really helpful article, so be sure to read it. And use it throughout the course for argument ideas, for forms of reasoning when you present your discussions in the activities. And he provides a number of argumentative forms for ethical reasoning, so feel free to use those. They'll be beneficial for you in presenting your ideas and handling the theories too, just trying to make judgments yourself about them, okay? So that's how we want to approach ethical reasoning. Now let's turn to another detail in ethics on intuitionism, emotivism, subjectivism, and objectivism. Okay, this is related because of the way we are apparently or are told theoretically one of the proposed ways that we learn about ethics. Okay, so it relates to reasoning as well. This area of the lecture is kind of related thematically then. Okay, so discussion of ethics must also address the question how we know what is good. Okay, so someone says this is good, and you think, well, how do we know that, right? One theory is called intuitionism. Now, this theory contrasts generally, not always, it doesn't have to by conceptual necessity. It's not necessary that it does, but in practice, it just usually does, okay? Intuition usually contrasts with those other naturalistic kind of theories that I had mentioned, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and others at which we'll look, because they will try to ground the way that we learn about moral truth in perceptions of things, observations again, of the way we get descriptions of things when we see things. Okay, well, this theory about the way we know ethical truth says, no, it's not perception, it's intuition. And the intuitionism says that our ideas about ethics rest upon some sort of intuitive knowledge of ethics. And here, proponents of the theory are G.E. Moore and W.D. Ross. I mentioned Moore earlier when we talked about the naturalistic fallacy and Hume's problem. He's a very famous philosopher. W.D. Ross as well. Others, and etc., others, of course, have held this view and continue to hold this view too today. So for discussion of intuitionism, to see the Dimmock and Fisher reading, 2017, pages 104 to 105. We know ethical truths the way we know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Okay, so the idea there is that when we learn mathematics, we learn it kind of through repetition. When we were young, remember, think back to grade school, right? Third grade, fourth grade, sixth grade. You get mathematical exercises every week, almost every day, and you just do them. And then after a while, you just see that it's true. You learn the principles and the truths, simple truths of arithmetic, like a 2 plus 2 equals 4. So we don't actually go out and put, say, 2 apples together and then another 2 apples together and then go, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 2 plus 2 does equal 4. I proved it empirically. We don't learn mathematics that way. We just do the exercises and we do them enough and then we just see, that's right, right? So we think that theoretically, one explanation is that we're learning mathematics through intuition. And after doing the exercises, we just see that some of the truths are true. And we can see why 2 plus 2 equals 5 is false, right? Well, in a similar way, think of an analogy then. Some people think that the way we learn about morality is the same way. It's intuitive, and when we start to make ethical judgments, it's like learning mathematics. We do it enough through repetition, we get better at it, and we just see the truth, the moral truth, in the same way that we see mathematical truth. Okay, now this theory is called intuitionism again. Another view is called emotivism, and this view says what is good is what is just approved, kind of what people like. Think of it as what is emotion. Okay, A.J. Ayer holds this view, Adam Smith, David Hume held something like it, etc. And that view, emotivism, then is discussed in the Dimmock and Fisher textbook, 2017, pages 112 to 113. So regardless of the theory there that we hold, the question arises whether our judgments are objective or subjective. Does the mere fact of disagreement about what is moral, whether we claim we learned the truth through intuition or emotion, mean that our moral judgments are relative or subjective? Here, subjective means individualized, so that what someone believes is mere opinion. All right. So objective means that there is something good in the act or right about the act itself, apart from our judgments. Okay. So those is a fine-grained distinction, and some people will think, well, moral truth is really subjective, and others think, no, that can't be the case. Moral truth is something that, if it's true, if there is moral truth, it's something about the external world and not just our own subjective ideas. And we'll learn more about that debate later in the course when we look at metaethics. That has some really complex material. It's more abstract, and we'll look at it at the end of the course. We'll save the harder stuff for last, because I think after we learn more about the theories and some of the issues in ethics, we'll just be better equipped to handle that more difficult material at the end of the course, right? So I think it's a better way to organize the material for us. But we'll keep it in mind. We'll look at that later in the course. So return to ethical reasoning and arguments. I mentioned the previous article. Where was it? Svalba's article, What is Ethics and What Makes Something a Problem for Morality? Okay, so ethical arguments are needed to justify our moral judgments. So for example, one such argument may look like the following. Every human life is valuable. Whatever has a good chance of saving such a life should be attempted, right? My swimming out to rescue this person has a good chance of saving his or her life. Say someone's in danger of drowning. So therefore I should do so. I should save this person. And so then the reasoning offers support that the reasoning for the conclusion are called the premises. And so in a sound argument, the premises are true and the conclusion follows from them. And that's the ideal type of argument we want, a good argument where true premises, good logic, and the conclusion's true. So that's a sound argument. Okay, so this argument is typical of the types of arguments and lines of reasoning we make when making moral judgments. Again, see this Volba article in 11, 2019, page 7 to 16. When we look closely at this specific argument that I mentioned, though, we may wonder why it is important to save a human life when you have the chance. And this is what the moral theory you hold is supposed to answer or do. It's supposed to support that reason. Okay, so it says every life is valuable. Whatever has a good chance of saving such a life should be attempted. Those were the first two premises of the argument. So then ethics will kind of answer those, the assumptions behind those claims. What does it mean to say human life is valuable? Why is it good to try to preserve that then? Right? These different ethical theories at which we'll look will answer those questions, and that's what will ground the reasoning in your ethical arguments, and that's what grounds the reasoning in that example, ethical argument example. Okay. So when we look at that specific argument, oh, I'm sorry, I'm backtracking here. Okay, so the theories at which we'll look will give you different ways of justifying the arguments, and that will kind of depend on the kinds of theories you use then in moral reasoning. Okay, but the focus will primarily be on the theoretical side of things as we learn more about the theories themselves. Not so much applied ethics, but we will look at cases naturally enough when we study the theories. Okay. We will continuously apply our theoretical work, though, to practical issues. But the course will look at theoretical issues. We'll look at the theories in practical ethics, apply them, and then we'll look at ethics as well. So there are a number of ways ethical reasoning can go wrong in arguments, and we call these fallacies. Fallacies are problems for logical reasoning, whether it's ethics or non-ethics. Okay, so if we're using logic, fallacies can arise. And since we're using logical reasoning in ethics, fallacies can arise. So here's an example list of some erroneous logical steps of which we want to be aware and try to avoid in our reasoning and in discussing the theories in the cases at which we'll look and in the forums in which we'll participate. In your own reasoning, handling the theories, you'll make judgments yourself, right? So being aware of these fallacies will help you avoid committing them when you're handling the theories yourselves, the cases yourselves, and then especially in discussion with each other, okay? So here's an example. All men are mortal. Oh, I'm sorry. The fallacy, one fallacy is called an ad hominem fallacy. That's from the Latin, attack against the man, ad hominem. So the problem with that kind of reasoning is that you ignore the evidence and the logic of the argument, and you just attack the person. And the fallacy there is that you don't really deal with the arguments, the reasoning then, right? So we want to avoid these kinds of personal attacks on people for some reason. This person has a big nose. Well, it doesn't tell you their theory is mistaken or their judgments are mistaken, right? So we definitely don't want to include that kind of attack, fallacy in our logical reasoning when we handle the arguments, okay? Also, begging the question or circular argument, something about which we want to be aware. If our premises are the same as the conclusion, say, you could see a circularity there, because then what you're doing is you're already assuming the conclusion in a premise before you get to the conclusion. So that creates the worry about a circular argument. You're question begging. The problem there is then we don't really establish what we're claiming. So we want to be careful, try to avoid circularity. That relates to the subject, the concept of justification I mentioned. Since we need to offer some kind of reasoning and support for our judgments, the reasoning can't be circular, right? Because then there is no justification. So that's why we want to avoid circular reasoning. So we get that relationship in our discussions right. There's evidence, conclusion, and it's just not circular. We can avoid a fallacy there. Okay, so with ethical theory, explains Zolva, in addition to arguments, we might develop and defend an ethical theory or an account of what ultimately ethical values consist in. Okay, so ideally, I recommend working with theories. We're going to look at a number of them and try to figure out whether you think one's better than the other, and it's okay to adopt theories and change your mind through time and research. Don't be afraid to say this looks fine, and then later say, I guess not. Also, as we move through the theories, you might think that some problems arise, but that doesn't mean the whole theory is bad. There might be different versions of a theory, and some problems will arise for some of them, but not for others, right? So the idea isn't to create discouragement that we don't know what we're talking about in ethics because theories can have some problems. Rather, um, uh, we can look at areas for future work development maybe that might be needed by philosophers and ethicists. We could also look at how we can make maybe new theories ourselves for the future, right? And one prospect also that presents itself is combining some of the different theories at which we'll look, okay? Perfectly intelligible sounds fine to me. So keep those kinds of ideas in mind when we look at some of the theories, and we're going to look at some of their strengths and problems, okay? You'll eventually want to try to make judgments about which theories you think are better than others, and it's okay to hold to some of those, and you can be tentative about it. This looks good, and we're doing work. You don't have to figure it all out, okay, in the course. But try to learn to use the theories and apply them, okay? And it helps to also start to apply them beyond the course to examples in daily life, because that will help you learn the theories too. So some of the ethical theories, then, the types of ethical theories at which we'll look are egoism, where ethics are grounded mainly in our own interests, personal interests. Not a very good theory, but it's an old one. And the idea here then is individual pleasure or happiness is the key underpinning moral judgments. It goes back to Epicurus, pleasure is the good, and Bernard Mandeville, human beings are selfish. In the Archie and Archie textbook, Introduction to Ethical Studies, published in 2004, pages 212 to 226, 276 to 289. It's also in KO, What's in It for Me? On egoism and social contract theory in the Matthews textbook, okay, Introduction to Philosophy, Ethics, published 2020, pages 39 to 40. Okay, uh, there's utilitarianism. This view is similar to egoism. Pleasure or happiness become the focus. But it differs from egoism in that it's not individualistic. It doesn't look at what makes someone happy or gives someone pleasure. It looks at what makes the majority of people happy. What gives the most happiness or pleasure to the majority of people, not just the individual. And so that's the main difference between egoism and utilitarianism. And for more on utilitarianism, you can read Levin, 2019, pages 130 to 136, and the Archie and Archie book, 2004, pages 9 to 16, and 292 to 304. Also, Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, pages 11 to 28, and Matthews even, 2020, pages 45 to 51. Well, there's another theory called Kantianism or deontology, at which we'll look. This theory says that moral judgments are grounded in universal principles or rules, and they're objective. They're not just made up, okay? Think of it as kind of like the furniture of reality is the idea, okay? For more on deontology, see Levin, 2019, pages 173 to 175. Immanuel Kant, Act in Accordance with Universal Law, in Archie and Archie, 2004, pages 151 to 166. Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, pages 331 to 31 to 48, and Matthews, 2020, pages 52 to 63. We'll look at natural law theory. This theory says that functions of human nature dictate what is moral and what is or is not moral. The idea there is what is best for natural survival and development is what is good or right. What impedes natural growth and development is what is bad. Okay, and there are different versions of the theory. I've mentioned some of the naturalistic theories earlier when we talked about Hume. Some of these theories will share that kind of commitment, but then this is a specific version of a naturalistic theory, and it's called natural law theory. Okay, it grounds the right or the good in what's best for human nature and developing human nature. Okay, for more discussion of natural law, see Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, page 65 to 78, and Matthews, 2020, 45 to 87. We'll look at virtue ethics. Virtue ethics says that cultivating and developing positive character traits are what ground the moral life. Okay, so it's not just what's best for survival, but it's best for my character. And you want to become a certain kind of person, someone with values, right? So think of a contrast between someone who's very shady and unreliable, maybe a con artist or something like that. When you see movies, some of the bad guys, villains are like really poorly dressed and slouch a lot and maybe droll, and they just look like the kind of person you would never leave your kids with, right? Think of something like that to make a sharp contrast with someone who's an ideal citizen in the community, right? Whatever they do. And so it's just to help try to get an idea of the difference of character. And so this theory says character is what grounds moral judgments. We should be concerned with what kind of person we become, not just what we do, right? So for more on virtue ethics, see Levin, 2019, pages 176 to 180. Aristotle, what is the life of excellence? In Archie, 2004, pages 248 to 265. Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, pages 49 to 64, and Matthews, 2020, pages 27 to 36. And last of all, we'll look at a feminist theory of ethics, a popular one. There are different feminist theories, I'm sure. This is a very popular one. It's called care ethics. So on this theory, moral judgments are at root grounded in our emotions of caring for others and our relationships then. Emotions and relationships ground morality in care ethics, okay? So for more on care ethics, see Matthews, 2020, pages 64 to 74. See Stout, Care Ethics on the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy as well. We'll look at each of those theories in detail throughout the course. We'll look at explanations of them, how to learn how to apply them. We'll look at strengths and weaknesses of the theories, and we'll look at all of those theories and try to develop a better understanding of ethical reasoning, critical ethical reasoning in practice, in theory and in practice. And we'll do that before we look at the meta-ethics material in the course, okay? So I want to close the lecture with a consideration of the question, can ethics be taught? Can we teach ethics? Well, philosophers debate whether ethics itself is something that can be taught. If ethics is purely a subjective matter of opinion, then we may ask why we are taking this course. How can you be taught to think about anything if it's just opinions, right? This view is not without problems then, and we'll look closer at it in the course. Again, think of Hume's emotivism, all right, or the subjectivism. Positions that I had mentioned earlier. Those have some real problems in ethics. Okay, they just don't seem to track with our behaviors in reality. Some people hold to those views, though. They're not very popular. We'll look at them more in the course, though. Plato argued that ethics is something that can be taught, though, in contrast. Okay, there is something real to teach then, is what he's saying. He argued that people who do wrong do so out of ignorance, though. And so we may question that explanation. Is all bad behavior just ignorance, people acting out of ignorance? That doesn't sound right. I think people do things that they know are wrong and they try to get away with it, not because they're ignorant of what is right, but they just don't care. Think of the career criminal. They're probably not acting out of ignorance all the time there or something. So, but you can agree with Plato that there is something to teach. I think most ethicists will agree with Plato on that point, but will probably question his explanation that immoral behavior is always based out of ignorance. Okay, I mention it though because that was his view, and he is a significant thinker. So it stands to reason that by engaging in a study of ethics, we can better handle ethical questions and issues as we confront them in our daily lives. This will help us sharpen our critical reasoning, our critical thinking and reasoning skills. And since we do confront moral questions daily, whatever we may think of them initially, our study can prove beneficial and useful to our developing analytical skills to handle those questions in our daily lives. Okay, so along with the assigned reading and the material that I mentioned, I've also included multimedia, that videos and such that are linked in the module, the lecture, written lecture, the guidance, engaging the material, engaging with the material link for this week's module. And I will include my lecture there in written form with attachments and links to many of the articles and sources I've cited. And again, you can find the videos there at the end of that lecture, written lecture. I encourage you to use the videos when you can. They're helpful and they help in learning the material, and they're easy to access. I just provide the access right there in the module for you. So if you have any questions on anything we've covered, please feel free to reach out with by email with your questions or in the discussion forums. I also hold office hours, right? Every week. Feel free to stop by office hours. Time and access for the virtual office hour is provided in the announcement. It's just go to the announcement page for the office hours. You can get the information. If you need, if you don't have, if you want to talk about something through virtual office hours, but cannot make that office hour, the fixed office hour that I hold every week, send me an email and we can maybe set up some other time to talk. No problem. Okay. So it's been a pleasure to present this introduction to this lecture on ethics as we start our course, and I look forward to working more with everyone throughout the course and learning more from all of your research. Thank you for your time. I'll see you guys again. Bye-bye.